the sun, the provider of energy to all life on our planet. It was responsible for the formation of all our non-renewable energy, our oil and natural gas fields. And we want the sun to play an important part in our renewable energy needs as we seek to save our species from catastrophic climate change. The solar cell, the device that converts sunlight into electricity, has been around for over a century. Why are we seeing so much focus on solar power today? The answer is purely economic. With more solar cells being demanded, its unit cost has declined dramatically to a point where we now see these cells finding their way into all sorts of devices. They are now one of the least expensive forms of generating electricity. We see them in roof panels and in tall rows on farms, installed on 100 acres to well over 1,000, leased for 40 years. To understand solar electricity, it will help if we learn some of its common terms. We measure the ability to produce power in watts. Watts are like the horsepower rating of an engine. Solar panel manufacturers advertise their panels' peak capacity in watts, the maximum amount of power that a new panel can produce under ideal conditions. The typical house roof will have panels that, in theory, can produce 4,000 watts or 4 kilowatts. A solar farm will claim a capacity in millions of watts or megawatts. The typical solar farm is around 50 megawatts. They require about 200 acres of land. However, there are some being proposed that are 10 times that size. UK solar farms are mostly in England on moderate to good, flat agricultural land. The UK measures its solar capacity in thousands of millions of watts or gigawatts. The country today has around 15 gigawatts of solar capacity. That is 5 gigawatts on roofs and 10 gigawatts on farmland. That doesn't mean that the country can provide 15 gigawatts of electricity over an hour, let alone over the course of 24 hours. The peak of our output in mid-June on a rare sunny day over the entire country is just over half of our stated capacity. The most the UK seems able to produce on such a day over the course of 24 hours is around 3 gigawatts. Our demand on such a hot day in June is around 30 gigawatts. So on a day when solar would be expected to be at its peak, we are still only able to meet 10% of the country's demand. And over the course of an entire year, solar production only meets 5% of what we need. Let's look at where our electricity comes from on an average day, starting with solar generating 1.4 gigawatts. Our biggest source is natural gas, averaging 11.9 gigawatts, followed by wind at 8.6, nuclear 4.5, biomass 1.5, hydroelectricity 0.4 and coal 0.4, plus a little that we import from other countries. That makes a total of 29.5 gigawatts, our current average daily consumption of electricity over the entire UK. The UK government has a target to increase solar capacity from 15 gigawatts to 70 gigawatts by the year 2035. It anticipates that we will consume more electricity as we switch to electric vehicles and heat pumps and as our population grows. The country was making good progress 10 years ago on solar roofs, but the reduction in subsidies almost decimated the solar industry. The number of solar installation firms actually dropped. The UK government has not stated whether the growth to 70 gigawatts is going to come mainly from solar farms or solar roofs. Here, we are going to look at the pros and cons of each, and why you should care even if the government doesn't yet. In the past several years, hundreds of new applications for solar farms have been put forward, and hundreds more are anticipated. A trade lobbying group for solar farm developers claims that even when the 70 gigawatt target is met, the UK would be using only a very small proportion of its land mass for solar panels. That is true when one looks at the UK as a whole, but remember where sunlight conditions and layout of the land are ideal for solar. It is mainly flat farmland in crowded England, where plots for new housing are scarce. If we maintain today's proportion of 2 gigawatts on solar farms for every gigawatt on roofs to reach the 70 gigawatt target, that puts us on a path to covering 147,000 acres of farmland or 229 square miles in England within a decade, more than a third of the size of Greater London. Much of the area in planning or about to be proposed is our best and most versatile agricultural land, the kind where we now see crops growing. If this land is panelled, no crops will grow on it, and no houses will be built within its fences. Current solar farm planning applications will take this land out of agriculture for at least 40 years. The only form of agriculture that can theoretically be used on panelled land is sheep grazing, but there are only a few examples where sheep and panels can coexist. These have been short-lived and were small in scale. Rows of solar panels make sheep herding more difficult. The quality of the grass to be grazed is greatly diminished by the damage done during installation, followed by panel shadowing and by increased runoff. Rain drips off the lower edge of panels, forming rivulets in the ground, and is not absorbed beneath the panels. The grass is too poor for lambs. The changes those installations make to the land could take those areas out of agriculture well beyond 40 years with the damage done to the soil. Topsoil, once flushed out to sea, is gone. It can take hundreds of years to replace an inch of fertile topsoil naturally. Britain already imports close to half of our food, and much more than that when you include the import of food ingredients. Our food imports are growing, making us more dependent on what happens elsewhere. The European countries where we import most of our food from will also experience climate change. They can expect more frequent droughts. With competition for housing also taking land out of agriculture, the country needs to look very carefully at the trade-off between our food production and how we generate the electricity to cook that food. Solar panels on roofs use areas that would benefit from shadow. Britain's largest warehouses have roof space for 15 gigawatts of new solar. There are also about 12,000 non-multi-story car parks in the UK where cars are exposed to the elements. Many could be covered with panelled roofs to protect cars from rain and keep them cool in the summer. We have 26,000 state schools across the country. School buildings alone make up half of our public buildings, but the government has failed to make significant commitments to improve school buildings. As a result, very few schools have solar panels. We also have 6 million detached houses and 8 million semi-detached homes. If each had 4 kilowatt solar systems, that equates to 56 gigawatts. At a bare minimum, it should be a legal requirement for developers to include panels on the roofs of all new houses. It is claimed that this would increase the cost of housing, but if all houses on a new development were equipped at the same time, the cost to each owner would be considerably less than installing panels later. All the food we eat is already stored solar energy. Crops are solar batteries, so all farms are solar farms. If we diminish and damage even a small portion of our nation's best farmland by covering it, we risk harm to our population for generations. In the next episode, we compare the effects of solar farms and solar roofs on the environment and our economy.